Welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is David and I'm joined here today with Laura. And today, Laura and I are going to take you through using parameters in Stata, local and global macros explained. Now, we're doing this one because we cover a bunch of different webinars, a bunch of different topics where we use local and global macros. So this one's going to delve into these a little bit deeper. If you want to watch or learn about Stata and programming, you need to have watched this webinar. Okay, so let's dive into it, Laura. Our agenda for today, we're going to have a look at what a macro is, how to define a simple macro, using temporary macros and programs in do files, I should say, an overview of extended macro functions, how to define an extended macro, and then some practical examples. All right, Laura, that seems like quite a bit to cover. Right, Laura, this is now your space. What is a macro?
So this is something that in different programming languages, if you've ever used anything like that, sometimes called a parameter or a variable, container, an object. Obviously, Python calls it a variable. That's not particularly useful in Stata because variables are something else in Stata. So Stata calls this a macro. Probably the word container is the most accurate way to describe what a macro actually is. So it's a word that holds something else in it. So you can create a word and assign a value to it, and that word now contains the value that you assigned to it. And so when you reference that word correctly in Stata as a macro, Stata will go, oh, you're talking about the value you assigned to that word and substitute in that value. So I've got very simple examples here. I've got a container with 3 apples in it. So I assign the number 3 to the word apple. So if I want to see how many apples are in my container, I can ask Stata and I can say, tell me what is contained in the macro apple. And Stata will go, you asked about the macro apple. That has the number 3 in it. And display that there are 3 apples.
Right. So it's sort of like a box. I put some stuff in the box, and when you ask for the information that's in the box, Stata gives you the contents. Okay. There are 2 types of macros, aren't there? There's local and global. So what are the difference between those 2, Laura?
So a local macro is transitory. That means it only remains in Stata's memory for as long as either the interactive session, the do file, or the program is active. So this is why they're mostly used in do files and programs, because you can create it, and once the do file has completed or the program has completed, that macro is then just wiped from memory state. It's like, I don't need this anymore, and it goes away.
Right.
Whereas a global macro is permanent within an interactive session. So it will persist across do files or programs. So even if you defined your global macro in a do file, once that do file closes, that global macro remains in existence until the end of your Stata session.
Right.
So local macros are preferred most of the time, just because it doesn't interfere with other programs or do files. You can certainly have a problem if you use global macros a lot in your programs and you make a program and someone else makes a program and you happen to use the same global macro, that can cause problems. So it's definitely better to use your, especially when do files and programs that you write.
So if I wanted to record where I was working every day, I could create and record that within the logs and the data sets that I'm working with. I could create a global macro called location and put my location at the start of the session into that. And then the global macro would know that I'm at home or at office or wherever, whatever I entered in at the start of the session.
Yeah.
Right.
Until you override it, you either override it with something else or you get rid of it, but it will persist unless you do something to it.
Right. Okay.
Stata's extended macro functions will work with both local and global. Although most of the time, as I said, you're using your local macros.
Okay. Let's have a look at a simple macro. So a simple macro is where you're going to assign a value you choose to a word that you choose. So, and it can be numeric or text. Yeah. And the word can be any single word that you choose. Although it's probably a good idea not to use words that are Stata reserved words.
It won't let you.
It won't let you?
No.
Right.
But there aren't very many of them. Generally speaking, it does have to be one word. If you have like a 2-word macro, you would have to join them with an underscore.
Right.
Because it still has to be one set of characters. As soon as you put a space in there, you've sort of ruined everything. So it doesn't have to be one continuous word.
Right.
So there's 4 steps to declaring a macro. The first is to tell Stata what type it is, so whether it's local or global. Then you give the name of your macro. So for example, from my previous example, then you put an equal sign to indicate you're assigning a value to that word. And then finally, you enter your assigned value. So we've got 2 examples here. Local apple equals 3.
So it's local is you're declaring the type. Apple, number 2.
Apple is the word that I've chosen.
So you've given that one word name. Yeah. And then part 3, you've entered the equal sign.
It's basically saying I'm now going to assign something to this word.
Right. And then number 4, you've assigned the value
3.
You've assigned the value 3 to it.
In this case, yeah. And so my second example, this time I'm going to do a global instead of a local.
Yep.
I'm going to call it orange, and then I'm putting the equals to say I'm assigning something to this word orange. And in this case, I've done text. And you'll notice when you're assigning a string to a macro, you need to put double quotes around it. So I'm saying the color of the sun is what I've assigned to the global macro orange.
Right. So even though one's local and one's global, they actually go through the same 4 steps. Okay. That makes it simple. So, Laura, how do we use these macros? We've now put something into them. We've got the number 3 in apple, and we've got something about the sun in our macro called sun.
Orange. Yeah.
Orange. Yep. And so now, how do we actually make use of these?
So you have to tell Stata that the word that you're giving it is a macro. And the reason for that is if you just type in a word by itself, words in Stata are generally commands. So if you just type in a word, Stata is going to look for it as if it's a command. And in this case, it's not a command. So we need to tell Stata that this is actually a macro, not just a standard word. So when you then use that special grammar to call that macro, the return result that you'll get from that is what was contained in that word. So if we ask Stata to display the macro apple, it will give us the number 3. If you ask it to display the macro orange, we'll get the text printed out, color of the sun.
Right.
So there are some important caveats to this in terms of how the grammar works, which we will.
But if I type just display apple with nothing
else,
it's just going to give me the word apple, isn't it?
No, the display command, if you're putting text in, the display command requires that you give double quotes.
Yep.
If you did display apple in double quotes, then yes, you just get the word apple. You haven't told Stata that it's a macro.
Right. So tell us about this special macro grammar.
So if you've got a word that is a local macro, you tell Stata it's a local macro by bookending it with a graph, which is like a left-sided apostrophe. It's on the tilde key next to the 1 key on most keyboards. We've got a little image here to show. It's important that this is to distinguish that this is a graph, not an apostrophe. If you put an apostrophe here, it won't work. And then at the end of your word, you put a real apostrophe. That's graph, the word that you've chosen for your macro, and then apostrophe. So in the case of our apple, it's graph, apple, apostrophe.
Right. And that would give us the number 3 back.
Yes.
Yeah.
If your local macro has a string in it, you often have to put double quotes around that string, depending on what you're doing. Sometimes it needs double quotes, sometimes it doesn't. So it does depend on how you're using it with other commands. For example, if you're using it with the display command, it needs the double quotes.
Right.
And when you're defining strings, as we said before, you also need to put them in double quotes.
So then it gets a bit more complicated.
So Stata also has what it calls compound double quotes. And this is for defining text into a macro when it has a special character in it that Stata would normally interpret as something. Or if you're calling a macro that has text in it where these special characters are present, you need to use compound double quotes. So the really obvious one is just the double quote by itself. If you, as we've said, double quotes in Stata indicate that you're defining a string. If you don't actually want to define a string and you just want your double quotes to appear as double quotes in text, then you need to use compound double quotes around that text to indicate that anything within the compound double quotes is text and should be ignored if it's a special character.
Right.
So compound double quote is just to open the graph and then double quotes, and then to close it's double quotes. Should be.
Right.
And then finally, because local and global macros are different, global macros have different grammar associated with them. So instead of bookending your global macro with your two types of apostrophes, we're just going to put a $sign and then our global macro word. So for example, the one we had before was orange. If I wanted to call, say, Stata, tell me what's in my orange global macro, I would just put $and then the word orange.
Right. So let's have a look at that in as an example. So local apple equals 3. So we've put 3 into our apple.
If I display apple and say it's a macro, I get the number 3, which is great.
Yep.
Global orange, again, same example, color of the sun. So you can see I've put that in with my double quotes to say there's text. And then I'm saying $orange because it's a global macro, and you can see the text displayed.
Right. Temporary macros. So Laura, these are new to me. Tell me about these temporary macros.
These are special. Again, they're only really temporary if you use them in a program or a do file. You can use them interactively. Generally speaking, you're not going to. Most of the time when you use these, you're using them in a program or do file.
Yeah.
And they're just a way of creating temporary things that will be cleared once that do file or program is finished running. There's 3 types. There's temporary variable names. Then there's temporary names for macros, scalas, which is sort of a type of numeric macro, matrices or frames.
Right.
And the third type is temporary file names.
Right. Okay.
So anytime you set up a temporary macro, you declare this at the start of a program or a do file.
Yep.
And then at some point within that program or do file, you're going to use it to do something. So, for example, if you create a temporary variable name at the start of your program, at some point during your program, you use that temporary name to
Yep.
create a variable.
Yep.
And then when that do file finishes, that temporary variable is removed from your data set. So it's there from when it's created within the do file to the end.
Yep.
And then Stata drops it from the data set when it's finished.
Right. Okay.
So
Yep.
it's totally wiped. So this is the same. So temporary variables are dropped from the data set. Temporary macros, scalas, matrices, and frames are completely wiped from memory, like they were never there. And temporary files are erased. So I've got.
And you can have all of them as macros.
These are all types of macro, yeah. So I've got a little example here. So we've got, I'm setting up every type. So I've got temp var, my var. So my var is my temporary variable name.
Yeah.
These are all macros, by the way. We've then also got temporary name. So I've got macro, scala, matrix, and frame. And then I've created a temporary file macro called new file.
Yep.
And when I use these, so for example, my temporary variable name, I've got generate, and then you can see I'm calling it as a local macro. So that's all of these local macros with essentially gobbledygook, randomly generated gobbledygook in them. So I'm generating a new variable called the macro myvar, and equals make. So I'm essentially just copying the make variable. And so essentially what's happening is within this myvar macro is a gobbledygook bit of text. So for example, underscore 00001. So I'm generating a new variable called underscore 001 in this data set. And when this do file completes, that temporary variable will just be wiped from the data set. So it'll totally disappear.
Right.
So you do the same with everything else. So local macro, which I created up here, I'm putting in the words a macro into this. This one's really important. I've had to call it twice. So you can see there's two graphs here and two apostrophes within the text when I'm displaying it. And the reason for that is that because this is a macro in itself, I'm essentially calling it twice. So I'm saying Stata will deposit the word macro, and then whatever is contained within that macro is another macro that holds this. So it's only with temporary macro names is this something you have to worry about.
Right.
Everywhere else, you just call it as is. About the number 300 is in my temporary scala matrix. Matrix. I've just put an empty matrix in, and then frame create, and then my frame will create just an empty frame from this macro. And we sort of see that in action. I've got a little video just to make it a bit easier. So if I click execute, it's just doing all these things that we just looked at.
Yep.
So we can see I've created auto, but you can see the actual frame name is this underscore 000 because that's what Stata created as temporary. That was my temporary matrix. That's my sort of temporary scala, which you can see there. You can see I've created a temporary macro containing the first car in the data set, and there's my temporary file name, which has been saved in my temporary folder. So essentially what is happening here is Stata is this. So it's a variable. The variable one's a really easy one to use as an example. But if you've got a temporary variable, you don't care what that variable is called. You're using it to do something in your program or your do file. It's going to disappear. You might be doing a calculation, but you don't need it for the end result. So you don't really care what it's called. You don't want to have to worry about remembering what it's called so you can get rid of it from your data set later on. So these temporary macros allow you to basically get Stata to do that for you. So Stata will create a macro using the word that you've given it. And within that macro will be a variable name that works. So it'll be, because there's certain naming conventions that you can't use for variable names. So it will create a macro that is correct and will work as a variable name. And then because it's specially generated at the end, Stata knows what to look for to get rid of. So it's basically just automating that process. So you're not ending up with a whole bunch of new variables that you then have to go and get rid of later.
Right. So extended macro functions, these allow you to extract information from your data set and your results, go and store them in a macro. So you may have seen our frames webinar where we discussed taking frames or results and putting it in a separate frame. Is that the type of action we're doing here? We're putting results into a macro? Or?
So we're extracting information, and there's various reasons why you might want to do this, but you're pulling it into a macro to then use it for something. So I do this in our markdown reporting webinar where I'm sort of setting up an automated report, and the title of that report, I want to use the data set as the title for that report. So I can, in that reporting section, I extracted the dataset label into a macro and then set it up to say, put the contents of this macro as the title for my report. So that's the sort of thing we're pulling out. You're pulling out information and attributes that you then might want to use for something. So you can extract program properties, data attributes, so you can get the type of the storage type of a variable, or what format it's currently in, so it's display format, different things like that. You can pull out file names or file paths. So if you have a data set loaded and you want to use the file for something down the line, like you might want to pull out whatever that directory is, so you can put something else in there, for example. You can extract matrix properties. So this is like row or column names, for example, which can be useful if you're trying to put a matrix into a report. All sorts of different things you can pull out of matrix properties. And then also string parsing. So if you have a list of variables, for example, in a macro, you could count the number of words and therefore variables in that macro. Or if you wanted to loop through a list of variables, you could do that by extracting the numbered word from each list and looping through.
So is this like a bit like underscore n, which is the number, or underscore capital N, which is the total number of observations?
Yes, those are system macros that just exist.
Yeah.
Whereas this would be you creating a macro to pull information out of a particular variable set or whatever
Right.
you're working with.
Right. So let's have a look at how you define an extended macro. So this is where you're going to assign the value to a macro from some of this information
Yeah, so
you've
whatever information you
created or observed.
Whatever information you want to pull out of your data set or your results, you have to pop into a macro, and there's a special way of doing that with these extended macros. So the value that you're going to get is going to be determined by the function that you use. So this is where macros really shine, because I can use this and I might need to know, for example, I might need to know the storage type of a particular variable, but I'm not necessarily going to know what that variable is, and I just want to pull out the storage type and use it for something. So rather than me manually going and finding the variable and looking at what the storage type is, I can just say, here's the variable name, tell me the storage type, save it in the macro, and I can then call that macro to put that storage type where I want.
Right.
So again, it's a single word that you choose, and it's defined with 4 steps, but 4 steps are just slightly different. So the first is always the same. Declare the macro type. Is it a local or a global?
Yep.
Second step, you give your macro name. So that's the same as well. So for example, use the word storage type, or one word, you can see there's no space. Third step is the colon. So instead of an equals sign, we're using a colon for extended macros to indicate that what comes after that colon is going to be some kind of defined extended macro function. And then the fourth part of it is to enter the function that you're using in the form required. So different extended macro functions work differently and require you to give different information to get what you need. So that's all in the help file. All the extended macro functions will tell you exactly what you need to do to call them.
Right. Okay.
So,
but if you can follow these 4 rules, and that will help.
Yes. So I've got 2 examples here. One's for a local. So I'm creating a local macro looking at storage type. I'm giving my little colon to indicate that this is an extended macro function. And then I'm giving the word type and then a variable name. So I'm saying store the storage type of this variable in the local macro storage type. And then if I were to then go and display that storage type macro, I would get integer, for example, or byte, or whatever the storage type was for that variable.
Right.
My second example is a global this time, but it's the same steps, global. I'm calling the macro second word because I'm extracting the second word. I'm giving my colon, and then I'm giving the format for the macro function. So in this case, I'm saying word 2 of this is a string.
Yeah.
And so I'm saying, please put in my macro second word, the second word of the string. This is a string. So the word is what would end up in that.
Wouldn't the word two?
So word two, I'm saying the second, so word, and then two, I'm saying the second word of, and then this is a string, is the string that I'm talking about. So is the second word of the string that I've given it after the word of.
So if we said word three, it would give us I, or word four, which string.
Yeah.
Can you do character?
No, so it's really only word. So it's just doing it by word, and words are by separated by space usually. I've never done this with a different type of character, but I believe if you had a string that was separated by, for example, commas instead of spaces, you could tell it that the separator was commas and it would still work.
Right. Okay. Enough of my curly questions.
So these are just some useful extended macro functions that I have used for various reasons. So this is all what comes after the colon. So type and the name of the variable, that's the storage type. Format, and then the name of the variable will give you the display format. So for example, if it's a string, it's just %s. Or if you've got a particular heading format for your string, but usually it's just %s.
Yeah.
Variable label, and then the name of the variable will give you the text variable label. So for example, in the auto data set, the variable make, its label is make and model. And so if I were to use the variable label and then the word make as an extended macro function, I would get a macro that contained the words make and model. You've got value label. This will extract the name of the value label that you have attached to a numeric categorical group. So again, in the auto data set, if I were to use this on the foreign variable, I would get the word origin in my macro because origin is the name of the label attached to the foreign variable.
Right.
You've then got label and then in brackets, a variable name and then a number will extract an individual label from the label that's attached to a variable. So for example, if I did label foreign 1, I would get the word foreign in my macro because that foreign is what is attached to the number 1 for that categorical group.
Yep.
You've then got word count and then string. So this could just be another macro or even just a straight up string that I've given it, or it could be a list of variable names and it will just give me the total number of words counted with space as the separator.
Right.
Word number of string we demonstrated before.
Yep.
And then there's a special sub in string extended macro function, which is a little bit more complicated, but it's essentially you're subbing something into a macro that already exists. So it's a macro that contains a string and you're just trying to make replacements to it.
Okay.
These are just kind of the ones I've used the most. There's so many of them. There's lots of matrix ones. So definitely have a look at the help file and all the different sort of bits and pieces you can extract.
So let's have a look at a video here.
I've got a little example. So I'm creating a macro called MPG type, and I'm extracting the storage type for MPG. And if I display that macro, you can see that MPG is stored as an integer. And we can go in and we can have a look and we can see that, yes, the storage type is in fact integer.
Yep.
And then I'm creating another macro called MPG format, which I'm extracting the format, the variable MPG. And you can see it's got %8.0G, which is the standard numeric display format.
Yep.
I've then got MPG label. So I'm extracting the variable label of MPG, which is mileage with MPG in brackets. That's what we should see printed when we display it. Yep. So that's the variable label, which you can again see over in the properties pane on the.
Yep.
So now I'm going to extract the name of the value label attached to the foreign variable. And if I display that macro, you can see the word origin displayed. So that's
Yep.
the name of that label.
Yep.
We can see that if we go and click on the foreign variable on the right panel. I've then I'm creating another macro called foreign underscore O label. So I'm extracting the label for the number 0. And then if I display that, I get domestic. So the number 0 is stored with the label domestic over the top. And if we go and actually have a look at our data set, we can see that. If we click in, we can see 0 underneath the word domestic.
Yep.
This is just a standard macro where I'm extracting the first observation of make, which is AMC Concord. I'm going to count how many words are in that macro.
Yep.
And you can see when I'm counting words, I haven't put double quotes around it. And that's because if I put double quotes around my make variable, I would actually get the value 1 instead of 2 because it counts in double quotes. It'll count that as one word.
Right.
We can see I'm extracting the first word, which is going to be AMC.
Yep.
Out of AMC Concord.
Right. So local.
And then I'm going to do just a sub-in string. So I'm substituting AMC with nothing in a new macro called make sub. And so if I display that, we only see Concord because I've essentially removed the word AMC by performing that string substitution.
So we want to show you some practical examples of how you might do this. Let's have a look at in profile.do. Now we won't dig into what profile.do is, but it's an important file that tells Stata how to run on your computer.
Yeah, so it's basically the way that you personalize your own Stata. So essentially you can put whatever commands you want into your profile.do. As long as you put it in the right place on your computer, Stata will run all of those commands every time you open Stata. So for example, a really simple one that I have here, I've got the CD command and then a particular folder. And so this is me basically saying, this is my default folder that I want to run Stata from. So don't open up in my documents folder, open PN. Just put that in. So you can, there's all sorts of funky things you can do. You can see here I've created a global called F4. And I've put the help date time display formats command into this global. This means that if I press F4 on my keyboard, this will load the date time display formats help file.
So the function key F4 on your keyboard. Okay.
Yeah. So I haven't tested this on Mac. This is on Windows.
Yeah.
So Mac might have a slightly different requirement in terms of setting it up, but just sort of funky things that you can add into your profile.do. So all sorts of different macros that sort of run things that can be done when you first load Stata. That's really useful. So loops, we have a whole separate webinar on loops, but loops rely very heavily on an understanding of macros. So in order to run a loop, you have to understand how macros work. So I've just got a really simple example here. The DS command, when given with no arguments, will create a local macro called var list, which you can see here. And when it's run with no commands, it creates a list of just every variable in your data set.
Right.
This disappears. So once you run another command after this macro will disappear. So if you want to keep it around to use it for something, you actually have to create your own macro, assign that list of variables, which is what I've done here. Just called it my var list. I'm just going to loop through this variable list. So for each var of var list, and then I've given my var list, which is a macro. So I've told Stata it's a macro.
Which you've taken from above.
Which I've taken from above.
Yep.
And then within my loop, I'm saying summarize and then the macro var. So for each loops, you're sort of defining the item that you want to sort of loop through. It's going to loop through my list of variables and summarize each individual variable. So it'll go through this list one at a time. And each new iteration, this will change to whatever the next variable in the list is. So we'll just summarize each variable individually. That's all the loop's doing. But the macros are sort of how this works. So macros are really important for that.
So let's show them how to do this one more time. So some fairly basic commands here to start off with.
So summarizing the variable price, and you can see when I've done that, the summarize command creates a bunch of macros that I can then use. So for example, I'm going to display the macro and it's telling me there's 74 observations for this variable. Display the mean, and you can see the mean displayed. And I can then save that mean in a macro that I'm going to call price mean, price underscore mean. And if I display that, we can see that same mean value shown. And if I were to rerun the summarize command on a different variable, I would still have the mean of price saved, and I could use it.
Right. Laura, we've covered a lot on macros there. So we've covered what a macro is, local, global, extended, how to get data into them, how to get data out of them, the special grammar that we've got to use. What sort of questions have we got coming in?